For the purposes of our webinar and our discussion, we're going to look at implicit bias and stereotypes as interchangeable, right? So this idea that you have different ideas about people in groups, whether they be automatic or knee-jerk reactions, and they are often negative, right? But, you know, occasionally you'll hear, for instance, like a stereotype that librarians only wear cardigans, pearls, and glasses, right? So not true, but not inherently harmful in the way that if you say Black people are lazy or that young Black men are thugs, right? Those move into stereotypes that are actually harmful and can cause actually physical harm in addition to mental harm. And so with that, and I have some definitions forthcoming to really situate what we're talking about with implicit bias, stereotypes, also stereotype threat. And then we're not really going to get into a discussion of microaggressions. That could be another webinar in and of itself. But the reason that I mention microaggressions is because it's part of the spectrum, right? So if we allow our implicit biases and stereotypes to really overtake us, and we actually start applying them and allowing them to inform our actions towards other people, then we start getting into the realm of microaggressions. All right, so to start with some of the definitions here. So, implicit bias, also known as social cognition, it refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. All right, so again, you're not necessarily meaning to think bad things or think negatively about a particular group. It's part of that socialization, it's part of that conditioning, and it's that knee-jerk reaction. I'm reminded about implicit bias by Vernee Myers. Some of you may have seen her at various conferences, and she's a speaker related to diversity and social justice, and she gives a really great anecdote about what implicit bias is and how it tends to manifest. And really quickly, she said that she was on a flight going to a talk, and they announced over the loudspeaker when the captain came on that it was a woman that was a pilot of the plane. And Vernee says that her initial reaction was, oh, cool, you know, women power, and I'm glad to have, you know, a woman in the cockpit. And she said later on during the flight, when they encountered some turbulence and things started getting a little bumpy, she said her first thought, just automatic knee-jerk reaction was, I hope this woman knows how to drive this plane. And she said that immediately she chastised herself because she said, why would I think that? It's part of that conditioning, right? That men are pilots, that men are in charge, that men know how to do certain things better than women. It's just part of that conditioning and that thought process, right? So that's an example of implicit bias. Now, similarly, a stereotype is any thought that is widely adopted about specific types of individuals or certain ways of behaving intended to represent the entire group of those individuals or behaviors as a whole. All right, so because of this conditioning, a lot of us might have the same automatic or knee-jerk reactions, right? So then that's when we start getting into the idea of stereotypes. So just to give you a couple of more quick examples, before I came to Illinois, I worked as an academic librarian, and I was reference and instruction. I would work a reference desk every afternoon, and the desk that I sat at had information across the front. Multiple times a week without fail, someone would come up to the desk and say, do you work here? Can I talk to a librarian? Okay, so this is part of that implicit bias because I did not fit their perception of what a librarian is, right? So then we get into a whole other set of stereotypes that librarians are only older white women, right? So when you see something that goes against that norm, oh, well, she can't be a librarian. I don't know what they thought I was doing at that desk, but it still was, went against their perception so much that they actually did ask, do you work here? Okay. I have been in other situations where I have been asked if I was the maid. if I was a clerk, anything other than a librarian or now as a college professor, right? Because again, I don't fit people's stereotypes or perceptions of what these people in these roles should look like. So with that said, when you start encountering this implicit bias in some of these stereotypes on a regular basis, and because, again, because of the socialization, we tend to share some of these stereotypes. Then we move into stereotype threat. And this is a situational predicament in which people are or feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to stereotypes about their social group. Okay, so for an example, I mentioned the library reference desk. So the article that I actually have cited at the bottom of the screen by Patricia Catapult, she mentions a particular story where a young African-American woman is hesitant to go up to the reference desk to ask for help because she believes that the white librarian has stereotypes against her. So she believes that the librarian might think she's asking a stupid question. And therefore she doesn't want to put herself in that situation. So she is therefore monitoring her own behaviors and actions because she doesn't want to submit to the stereotype that she thinks someone else has about her. All right, so this is when the implicit bias and the stereotypes are starting to become more explicit, right? Because they're now actually starting to impact behavior. So a similar example of that would be perhaps an Asian American student who is reluctant to seek out a math tutor because they're anticipating someone would say, well, you're Asian, you're good at math, right? And so again, monitoring the behavior because you don't want to submit to the stereotype. See. Okay, so there's another book that is really interesting. It's called Blind Spot: The Hidden Biases of Good People. And they actually refer to some of these implicit biases as social mind bugs, right? So again, this idea that we're being socialized and they're just kind of these unconscious little bugs in our mind, and they just happen to come out when we encounter certain things. And so the book says we fail to perceive individuals as individuals. They are often viewed as representatives of social groups. And so it's also this tension between these automatic reactions versus the thought that we have in our own mind that we should know better. Okay, and so this is when the stereotypes become particularly pernicious, right? We're no longer looking at people as individuals, but we're looking at them as larger groups. So it's easier to kind of apply these stereotypes to larger groups, right? And then if you were to call someone on a particular stereotype or bias that they have then expressed, then that's when you start getting reactions like, well, I have a Black friend and I have a gay friend, so I can't, be having stereotypes against this group if I have these individuals in my life, right? So then that's going to be the difference between perceiving people as individuals as opposed to applying stereotypes to larger groups. Okay, so again, they refer to them as social mind bugs. So this is just an example of the various types of implicit biases and also the different stereotypes. And obviously, bias and stereotypes are not limited to race and ethnicity, but can be related to age, can be related to religion, can be related to gender, sexual orientation, age, physical ability, mental ability. It could be any of these things. So you see on the screen, I'm a girl, so I must wear pink. Another one, let's see. I'm blonde, so I must be stupid, right? So we have our classic blonde jokes, right? Those are all based in stereotypes and implicit bias. All right, I wear black, so I must be an emo or a goth. I'm German, so I must be a Nazi, right? So we're hearing some more of these things currently as well. So I said that I would mention microaggressions just because it seems to be on that spectrum of implicit bias and stereotype threat, that if we continue to have these perceptions of people or groups that are different, as that becomes more explicit and as that becomes more common, it leads into microaggressions. And so a microaggression is a brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Now, some of you may be familiar with Gerald Wing Sue, who is credited with popularizing and really getting the discussion of microaggressions up and running. And so Sue concentrates a lot on race and gender. But again, just like the stereotypes, microaggressions can be targeted towards any group that's different, right? Because they are based on those stereotypes. So there can be gender-related microaggressions, religious microaggressions, any type of microaggression. It does not have to be explicitly towards people of color. So just to give you a couple of examples, and this is kind of the first foray into this idea that implicit bias, stereotypes, stereotype threat, microaggressions are a significant problem for those of us in library and information science, right? So libraries, information organizations, after all, we are microcosms of larger society. So whatever ails society, we are not immune from that. So the examples that I have on the screen here are from a Tumblr, LIS microaggressions. And if you go through that site, it is very possible that it's going to make you really angry, right? Because a lot of the statements, not only the ones that I have here, but the ones on the site, these are happening in library settings. Okay, so they're happening between coworkers, between folks that actually work in libraries, and they're happening amongst and in between patrons, etc. So an example, just because I have an opinion doesn't mean I'm an angry Black woman. Okay, stereotype, and when you start saying these things and applying them to groups, they slide into microaggressions. I have been called ethnic, exotic, and festive by my coworkers. I've also been asked if I'm something, with something meaning a race other than white.